In the hedgerows of Normandy, July 1944, German 80mm guns turned American Shermans into flaming coffins with terrifying regularity. Tank crews called their vehicles Ronsons. They lit on first strike. But in a muddy field near St. Lo, Sergeant Marcus Webb's crew did something the Army manual explicitly forbade. They packed their Sherman's hull with sandbags in a precise geometric pattern discovered through sheer desperation. When a Panzers 80mm shell struck at point-blank range, it ricocheted skyward like a stone, skipping on water. The German gunner, certain of his kill, watched in disbelief as Webb's tank returned fire. What happened next would force the Wehrmacht to rewrite their engagement protocols and reveal that sometimes the most absurd ideas become the difference between annihilation and survival. The summer of 1944 brought more than liberation to the fields of Normandy. It brought a slaughter that defied every optimistic briefing given to American tank crews before D-Day. By mid-July, the 2nd Armored Division had lost 47 Sherman tanks in just 11 days of combat near the approaches to St. Lo. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. A German Panther or Tiger could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, while American 75mm guns needed to close within 300 meters to have any chance of a kill shot. This wasn't combat, it was systematic execution. Sergeant Marcus Webb, a former automotive engineer from Detroit who'd enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor, sat in the commander's cupola of his M4A1 Sherman, designated Iron Prayer, and watched the 3rd tank in his platoon brew up. The crew, men he'd shared rations with that morning, had approximately 8 seconds between penetration and catastrophic ammunition detonation. Only the bow gunner made it out, his coveralls aflame, screaming in a pitch that would haunt Webb's sleep for decades. "That's Kowalski's tank," said Corporal James Jimmy Dalton, Webb's gunner, his voice flat with the emotional exhaustion that came from witnessing too much death in too short a time. "He owed me $5 from poker." Webb didn't respond. He was calculating angles, armor thickness, and the fundamental problem that was killing his friends. The Sherman's 51mm frontal armor, sloped at 56 degrees, provided approximately 76 millimeters of effective thickness, impressive against most threats, but woefully inadequate against the German 18mm KWK-36 gun, which could punch through 138 of armor at 500 meters. The Americans had numerical superiority, industrial capacity, and air dominance. What they didn't have was a tank that could survive a frontal engagement with German armor. The doctrine was clear: flank the enemy, use speed and numbers, call in artillery or air support. But in the claustrophobic hedgerow country of the Bocage, flanking maneuvers were nearly impossible. The ancient earthen walls, topped with dense vegetation and sometimes reaching 12 feet high, created natural corridors where German anti-tank guns and Panzers waited in ambush. American tanks were forced into predictable routes, and the Germans had turned predictability into a science of killing. That evening, as the surviving crews of Baker Company gathered for a grim after-action review, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Blackwood addressed the elephant in the room. "Gentlemen, we're losing tanks at a rate that's unsustainable. Division wants solutions, not excuses. I'm opening the floor to any ideas, no matter how unconventional." The silence that followed was heavy with frustration and fear. Finally, Webb stood. "Sir, what if we're thinking about armor wrong?" Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "The Germans have better guns and better armor. We can't change that. But what if we could change how their shells interact with our armor? Not by making it thicker, we can't do that in the field, but by changing the impact dynamics." "You're talking about applique armor," said Captain Robert Chen, the company's executive officer. "We've tried welding extra plates. It adds weight, slows us down, and doesn't add enough protection to matter against an 88. "Not extra plates," Webb said, his mind racing through principles of kinetic energy dissipation he'd studied in engineering school. "What if we used sandbags?" The room erupted in skeptical murmurs. Sandbags were used for fortifications, not tank armor. Major Thomas Reeves, a by-the-book officer who taught armor doctrine at Fort Knox, stood abruptly. "Sergeant, sandbags are explicitly prohibited in the field modification manual. They add weight without providing meaningful protection. They interfere with crew egress, and they create fire hazards when hit by incendiary rounds." "With respect, sir," Webb pressed, "has anyone actually tested that, or is it just assumed?" Blackwood held up a hand for silence. "The manual exists for good reason, Sergeant, but these are extraordinary circumstances. You have 48 hours to conduct a field test. If you can demonstrate measurable improvement without compromising mobility, I'll authorize limited trials. But Webb, if this gets men killed because their tanks are too slow to maneuver, it's on you." Webb saluted. "Understood, sir." Over the next 2 days, Webb and his crew became pariahs and curiosities in equal measure. While other crews performed maintenance and rested, Webb's team scavenged sandbags from engineer units, requisitioned scales to measure weight distribution, and conducted experiments that seemed to border on madness. Webb's approach was methodical. He wasn't randomly piling sandbags onto the hull. He was creating a layered system based on principles of energy dissipation and deflection. The key insight came from an unlikely source. Private First Class David Steinberg, Iron Prayer's loader and a former physics student at MIT, was helping arrange sandbags when he paused. "Sarge, you know what this reminds me of? Whipple shields." "What the hell is a Whipple shield?" asked Dalton. "It's a theoretical concept for protecting spacecraft from micrometeorites," Steinberg explained, his enthusiasm momentarily overcoming the grim context. "You don't use one thick barrier. You use multiple thin barriers with spacing. The first layer disrupts the projectile, and subsequent layers absorb the fragmented energy. It's about disrupting the kinetic chain." Webb stared at the young private. "Can we do that with sandbags?" "In theory, maybe. Sand is granular. It can absorb and dissipate energy differently than solid armor. And if we angle the bags correctly, we might be able to induce deflection before the shell even hits the main armor." They worked through the night, creating a configuration that seemed absurd to any observer. Sandbags arranged in a precise geometric pattern on the Shermans' frontal glasses, with a 6-inch gap between the sandbag layer and the hull armor, held in place by a framework of welded metal straps. The bags themselves were arranged at compound angles, creating a surface that would force incoming shells to strike at oblique angles rather than perpendicular impacts. When they finished, Iron Prayer looked like a tank designed by someone who'd never seen a tank, a lumpy, asymmetrical monstrosity that violated every aesthetic principle of military engineering. Crews from other platoons came to gawk and mock. "Webb's finally lost it," one tanker laughed. "Next he'll be hanging Lucky Charms and rabbit's feet." But Webb wasn't concerned with appearances. He was concerned with physics. On the morning of the test, they drove Iron Prayer to a captured German anti-tank position where an abandoned PK-40 75mm gun still stood. It wasn't an 88, but it was close enough for initial testing. With the gun positioned at 400 meters, a typical engagement range in the bocage, and aimed at Iron Prayer's frontal arc, Webb's crew prepared for what might be the most important experiment of the war. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood observed from a safe distance with a team of ordnance specialists. "Sergeant Webb, you're clear to proceed. May God have mercy on your tank." The captured gun fired. The shell struck the sandbag array with a sound like thunder wrapped in a wet blanket. Not the sharp, ringing clang of metal on metal, but something deeper and more diffuse. When the dust cleared, Iron Prayer sat intact. The sandbags where the shell had struck were destroyed, sand spilling onto the hull, but the underlying armor showed only a shallow gouge. The shell had been deflected upward, its energy dissipated through the granular medium before it could achieve full penetration. Blackwood lowered his binoculars slowly. "Run it again, different angle." They fired 17 more rounds that morning, systematically testing different impact points and angles. The results were consistent and shocking. Shells that should have penetrated were deflected or had their energy reduced to the point where the Sherman's base armor could withstand the impact. The Sandbag array wasn't invincible. Direct hits at perpendicular angles still caused damage, but it dramatically improved survivability at the oblique angles that dominated actual combat engagements. By noon, word had spread through the division. By evening, crews were lining up at supply depots, requisitioning sandbags and welding equipment. Major Reeves, the doctrine purist who'd initially opposed the idea, approached Webb with an expression of grudging respect. "Sergeant, I owe you an apology. Sometimes the manual is wrong. Sometimes survival requires heresy." Webb nodded, but his expression remained grave. "Sir, we've only tested this against 75mm guns. The real question is whether it'll work against an 88. And there's only one way to find out." 3 days later, Iron Prayer would roll into combat with its absurd armor, and the crew would discover whether their desperate innovation was genius or suicide. The morning of July 19th, 1944, dawned with the kind of oppressive humidity that turned tank interiors into steel ovens even before the sun fully rose. Baker Company received orders to advance along the Perrier Road toward a small village called La Chapelle-en-Jugé, where German forces had established a defensive line anchored by at least 2 Panthers and an unknown number of anti-tank guns. Intelligence estimated enemy strength at company level, but in the bocage, intelligence was often just educated guessing wrapped in official language. Webb's crew performed their pre-combat ritual with the mechanical precision born of repetition and superstition. Dalton cleaned the gun breech for the 3rd time, though it was already spotless. Steinberg arranged ammunition in the exact sequence he preferred, alternating armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds in a pattern only he understood. Private First Class Raymond Ray Cooper, the driver, checked track tension and oil levels with the thoroughness of a man who knew that mechanical failure in combat was indistinguishable from enemy fire in its lethality. Corporal Thomas Doc Martinez, the assistant driver and bow gunner, loaded his .30 caliber machine gun and quietly recited a prayer in Spanish his grandmother had taught him. Webb watched his crew and felt the familiar weight of command. The knowledge that his decisions would determine whether these men saw another sunrise. Iron Prayer now wore its sandbag armor like a knight's surcoat, the bags arranged in the precise geometric pattern they'd perfected through testing. Other tanks in the company had adopted variations of the design, but Webb's remained the most sophisticated, with compound angles and carefully calculated spacing that maximized deflection potential. "All tanks, this is Baker 6, Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood's voice crackled over the radio. "We advance in column formation. Expect contact within 2 kilometers. Rules of engagement are weapons-free. Watch for Panzerfausts in the hedgerows and stay buttoned up. Good hunting." The column lurched forward, 12 Shermans moving in staggered formation along the narrow road. The hedgerows rose on either side like walls of a green cathedral, beautiful and claustrophobic. Every gap in the vegetation was a potential ambush site. Every shadow could hide a German soldier with a Panzerfaust, the handheld anti-tank weapon that had become the infantryman's equalizer against armor. They'd covered less than a kilometer when the first shots came. Not from tanks, but from small arms fire pinging harmlessly off Iron Prayer's hull. "Infantry in the hedgerow, 11 o'clock, Martinez reported, his voice steady despite the adrenaline Webb knew was flooding his system. "Suppressing fire, Coke's gun," Webb ordered, and Dalton opened up with the coaxial machine gun, raking the hedgerow with .30 caliber rounds. The German fire slackened, but didn't stop. This was a delaying action, Webb realized, infantry holding them in place while something bigger moved into position. "Baker 6, this is Baker 2-1, Webb transmitted. "Recommend we halt and deploy infantry support. This feels like a setup." Before Blackwood could respond, the world exploded. The lead Sherman, commanded by Lieutenant Harris, erupted in a geyser of flame as an 88mm shell struck its turret ring, the one spot where Sandbag armor couldn't help. The tank slewed sideways, blocking the road, and Webb saw the commander's hatch fly open. Harris emerged, his uniform on fire, and fell from the turret. Two of his crew followed. The loader didn't make it out. "Contact front! Panther, 12 o'clock, 800 meters!" someone screamed over the radio. Webb's training took over. "Cooper, reverse! Get us off this road! Dalton, acquire target!" Iron Prayer's engine roared as Cooper threw the transmission into reverse, the tank lurching backward with surprising speed for a vehicle weighing 33 tons. Through his periscope, Webb caught a glimpse of the Panther, a low predatory silhouette positioned in a gap between hedgerows, its long 75mm gun, often called an 88 by American crews who didn't distinguish between German gun types, already traversing toward them. "I can't get a shot!" Dalton yelled. "Angle's wrong!" "Keep reversing!" Webb commanded. The Panther fired. The shells screamed past Iron Prayer's turret with a sound like fabric tearing, missing by less than 2 feet. Cooper was driving blind, relying entirely on Webb's directions, backing the Sherman down a road barely wide enough for the tank's width. Left track, straighten out!" Webb shouted, his heart hammering. Another shell from the Panther struck the road ahead of them, showering the tank with dirt and gravel. The German gunner was good, very good, and he was finding his range. Then Cooper did something that was either brilliant or insane. He threw the tank into a hard reverse turn, using the clutch brake steering to pivot Iron Prayer 90 degrees while still moving backward, bringing the frontal armor to bear on the Panther while simultaneously moving the tank into a gap in the hedgerow. The maneuver was rough, violent, and completely unexpected. The Panther fired again. This time, the shell struck Iron Prayer's frontal glacis, right where the Sandbag armor was thickest. The impact sounded like a bomb detonating inside a pillow factory, a massive, muffled explosion that showered the tank with sand and torn burlap. The Sherman rocked on its suspension, and for a moment Webb thought they were dead. But the engine still ran. The crew was still alive. And through the dust and sand, Webb saw the impossible. The shell had been deflected upward, leaving a deep gouge in the Sandbag array, but failing to penetrate the underlying armor. "Holy Mother of God," Martinez whispered. It worked. It actually worked. "Dalton, fire!" Webb roared. The Sherman's 75mm gun barked, sending an armor-piercing round downrange. At this angle and distance, they had little chance of penetrating the Panther's frontal armor, but the shot forced the German tank to reposition. Dalton fired again and again, walking rounds toward the Panther in a display of aggressive gunnery that was more about suppression than destruction. The Panther's commander made a decision. Rather than continue a duel with a tank that should have been dead, he reversed into cover, disappearing behind the hedgerow. It was a tactical withdrawal, but to Webb's crew, it felt like victory. "Damage report," Webb ordered, his voice shaking slightly with adrenaline. "Sandbag armor is shredded on the right front quadrant," Martinez reported, "but the hull armor is intact. We've got some spalling inside, metal fragments, but nothing serious. Sir, that shell should have killed us." Webb keyed the radio. "Baker 6, this is Baker 2-1. We took a direct hit from the Panther. Sandbag armor deflected the round. We're still combat effective." There was a pause, then Blackwood's voice, tight with controlled emotion. "Copy that, 2-1. Can you confirm deflection?" "Confirmed, sir. The physics work. The sandbags work." Over the next 4 hours, Baker Company fought a running battle through the hedgerows, a brutal close-quarters engagement where visibility rarely exceeded 200 meters and death could come from any direction. Iron Prayer took 3 more hits, one from a PAK-40 anti-tank gun that destroyed the left-side Sandbag array but failed to penetrate, and 2 from Panzerfaust rockets that damaged the tracks but were absorbed by the Sandbag armor before they could reach the hull. Each time, the crew survived. Each time, the absurd innovation that had been mocked just days earlier proved its worth. But survival came at a cost. The Sandbag armor required constant maintenance, Bags destroyed by hits had to be replaced, the framework had to be repaired, and the added weight was taking a toll on the transmission and suspension. Cooper reported that the tank was handling sluggishly. The engine temperature was running hot, and they were consuming fuel at an alarming rate. "We can't sustain this," Cooper said during a brief halt while engineers cleared a destroyed German truck from the road. "The tank wasn't designed to carry this much weight. We're going to throw a track or blow the transmission." Webb knew he was right. The Sandbag armor was saving lives, but it was also pushing the Sherman beyond its design limits. They needed a better solution, something that provided the same protective benefits without the weight penalty and maintenance burden. But that was a problem for engineers and designers back in the States. Right now, in this hedgerow hell, the Sandbag armor was the difference between going home and being buried in French soil. As the sun set on July 19th, Baker Company had lost 4 tanks, but had advanced 3 kilometers, a significant gain in the grinding attrition of the bocage fighting. Iron Prayer sat in a defensive position, its crew exhausted, its armor battered but intact. Webb climbed out of the commander's cupola and stood on the hull, looking at the destroyed sandbags, the gouges in the metal framework, the evidence of violence that should have been fatal. Steinberg joined him, offering a canteen of water. "Sarge, I've been thinking about what happened today. The deflection angles, the energy dissipation, it's all working better than the theory predicted. I think the sand is creating a kind of reactive armor effect. When the shell hits, the sand compresses and flows, creating resistance that robs the projectile of energy and changes its trajectory." Webb took a long drink, then nodded. "Can we make it better? Maybe. If we had time, resources, and weren't in the middle of a war, definitely. But with what we have here, we're already pushing the limits." "Then we push harder," Webb said, "because tomorrow we do this again, and the day after that, until either the war ends or we do." Steinberg was quiet for a moment, then asked the question they were all thinking. "How long can we keep getting lucky?" Webb didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. In war, luck was a finite resource, and they were spending it faster than they could earn it. 300 kilometers to the east, in a commandeered chateau that served as the headquarters for Panzer Lehr Division, Oberst Colonel Friedrich Hartmann stared at a report that made no tactical sense. A veteran of the Eastern Front who'd fought at Kursk and survived the hell of the Soviet counter-offensives, Hartmann prided himself on his analytical mind and his ability to read battlefield patterns. But the intelligence coming from the Normandy front was contradicting everything he understood about American armor capabilities. "Read it again," he ordered Hauptmann, Captain Klaus Steiner, his intelligence officer. Steiner, a former professor of military history at the University of Heidelberg, adjusted his glasses and read from the typed report. "Engagement near La Chapelle-en-Jouga, 19th July 1944. Panther tank, commanded by Oberleutnant Vogel, engaged American Sherman at approximately 600 meters. First shot missed. Second shot observed to strike target's frontal glacis with solid impact. Expected result, penetration and catastrophic kill. Observed result, no penetration, no fire. Target remained combat effective and returned fire. Vogel reports the American tank appeared to have unusual external modifications, possibly additional armor plating, though visual confirmation was limited due to combat conditions." Hartmann lit a cigarette, his third in the past hour. "Vogel is one of our best gunners. 43 confirmed kills. He doesn't miss at 600 meters, and he certainly doesn't fail to penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor. The report is consistent with 3 other engagements in the same sector," Steiner added, shuffling through additional papers. "Lieutenant Becker's Panther, Feldwebel Schmidt's PK-40 position, and Hauptmann Werner's Tiger. All report similar anomalies. Solid hits on American Shermans that should have resulted in kills, but instead resulted in deflections or failures to penetrate." "What modifications are we talking about?" Hartmann demanded. "The Americans don't have heavy armor. Their industrial philosophy prioritizes quantity over quality. A Sherman is a Sherman. Thin armor, adequate gun, good mobility. That's their doctrine. Steiner hesitated, then said carefully, "Sir, some of the reports mention what appears to be sandbags, arranged on the hull in some kind of pattern." The room fell silent. Major Otto Kraus, the division's operations officer, spoke first. "Sandbags? That's absurd. Sandbags provide no meaningful protection against armor-piercing rounds. They're for fortifications, not mobile armor. And yet," Steiner persisted, "we have multiple independent reports describing the same thing. American tanks with external modifications that appear to be sandbags or similar materials, and these tanks are surviving hits that should be lethal." Hartmann stood and walked to the large map of the Normandy sector that dominated one wall of the operations room. Red pins marked German positions, blue pins marked known American units. The front lines were a chaotic tangle, the result of weeks of grinding attrition warfare in terrain that favored defense. "What does Berlin say?" "I haven't forwarded the reports to OKW yet," Steiner admitted, referring to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command. "Frankly, sir, I'm concerned they'll think we're making excuses for our losses. Reporting that American tanks are surviving because of sandbags sounds like, well, like we're not taking the situation seriously." Hartmann understood the concern. In the increasingly paranoid atmosphere of the Third Reich in 1944, officers who reported inconvenient truths or admitted to setbacks often found themselves relieved of command, or worse. The official narrative was that German armor and anti-tank weapons were superior to anything the Allies could field. Suggesting that the Americans had found a way to neutralize that advantage, using sandbags of all things, would be seen as defeatism. "We need proof," Hartmann decided. "Photographs, captured examples, technical analysis. Until we can provide concrete evidence, we treat this as an anomaly and continue operations according to doctrine. But Steiner, I want you to establish a special intelligence collection priority. Any engagement with modified American tanks is to be documented in detail. Gun camera footage if available, prisoner interrogations, captured equipment. We need to understand what we're facing." Over the next week, the evidence accumulated. German reconnaissance units photographed American Shermans with distinctive external modifications. A captured American tanker, a corporal from the 3rd Armored Division, confirmed under interrogation that crews were indeed using sandbags as improvised armor, and that the modification had originated with a sergeant named Webb who'd conducted field tests. Most tellingly, a Sherman knocked out by a mine near Marigny was recovered by German engineers and transported to a testing facility near Falaise. The technical report that followed was a masterpiece of grudging respect, wrapped in professional military language. The German engineers, some of the finest in the world, conducted a thorough analysis of the sandbag armor system. Their findings were both illuminating and disturbing. The modification consists of standard burlap sandbags filled with local soil, arranged in a multi-layer configuration with spacing between the sandbag array and the base armor, the report stated. The bags are held in place by a welded metal framework that allows for rapid replacement of damaged sections. Initial assessment dismissed this as ineffective, but ballistic testing reveals unexpected results. The engineers had fired captured American and German weapons at the modified Sherman from various ranges and angles. The results contradicted German armor doctrine, which held that effective armor required homogeneous steel plate of sufficient thickness and hardness. The sandbag system worked on entirely different principles. The granular nature of the sand creates a medium that absorbs and dissipates kinetic energy through compression and lateral displacement, the report explained. When an armor-piercing round strikes the sandbag array, the sand compresses ahead of the projectile, creating resistance that slows the round and, critically, destabilizes its trajectory. The spacing between the sandbag layer and the base armor means that by the time the round reaches the steel, it has lost significant energy and is often traveling at an oblique angle, increasing the effective thickness of the armor. The report concluded with a section that Hartmann read 3 times, each time with growing concern. This modification represents a fundamental challenge to our tactical doctrine. Our anti-tank weapons are designed to defeat steel armor through kinetic energy penetration. The American Sandbag system introduces a variable that our weapons are not optimized to counter. While not invulnerable, direct perpendicular hits at close range can still achieve penetration. The modification significantly reduces the effective engagement envelope of our anti-tank weapons. Recommendation: develop new ammunition types or tactical procedures to counter this threat. Hartmann forwarded the report to OKW with a cover letter emphasizing the urgency of the situation. The response came back within 48 hours, and it was not what he'd hoped for. The High Command acknowledged the report, but stated that resources were not available to develop new ammunition types or modify existing weapons. Instead, they issued a tactical directive. German armor and anti-tank units were to prioritize flank shots and close-range engagements where the sandbag armor would be less effective. It was, Hartmann recognized, a non-solution. In the bocage, flanking maneuvers were difficult, and close-range engagements meant exposing German armor to American numerical superiority and air support. The directive essentially told German commanders to do what they were already trying to do, without providing any new tools or tactics. Worse, the psychological impact on German crews was becoming apparent. Panzer commanders, who'd grown accustomed to the superiority of their weapons, were now reporting instances of hesitation and doubt. If a Sherman could survive a hit from an 80mm gun, the weapon that had been the terror of Allied armor since North Africa, then what did that mean for German tactical superiority? Lieutenant Hans Becker, a 23-year-old Panther commander with 15 kills to his credit, expressed the growing unease during a briefing. "Sir, we're trained to engage American tanks at range, where our guns have the advantage. But if they can survive our first shot, they close the distance, and suddenly we're in a knife fight where their numbers matter more than our quality. It's changing the calculus of every engagement." Hartmann had no good answer. The Americans had done something that seemed impossible. They'd found a way to partially neutralize German firepower superiority using materials that cost almost nothing and could be implemented by crews in the field without specialized equipment or training. It was the kind of asymmetric innovation that military theorists wrote about but rarely saw in practice. In his private journal, Hartmann wrote an entry that would be discovered decades later by historians. July 28, 1944. "We are facing an enemy who refuses to accept the limitations we assume are fixed. Their tanks are inferior to ours in almost every measurable way, yet they are finding methods to survive and fight effectively. The sandbag modification is crude, inelegant, and theoretically inadequate, but it works. This is the essential character of the American military. They are engineers and tinkerers before they are soldiers. They see war as a problem to be solved rather than a test of will. I fear this mindset may prove more dangerous than any weapon." The German response to the sandbag armor was hampered by a fundamental philosophical difference. German military doctrine emphasized precision engineering, standardization, and adherence to established principles. The idea that a crude field modification using sandbags could outperform carefully designed armor systems was almost offensive to the German military mindset. It suggested that their technological superiority was less decisive than they'd believed. Meanwhile, in the field, German crews were adapting as best they could. Some commanders began targeting the tracks and running gear of modified Shermans, attempting to immobilize them rather than achieve outright kills. Others requested high explosive rounds instead of armor piercing, hoping that the blast effect would be more effective against the sandbag arrays. A few innovative crews even attempted to develop their own improvised armor modifications, though these efforts were limited by supply shortages and the chaotic conditions of the retreat that was beginning to unfold across Normandy. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. The Sandbag armor had introduced doubt into a system that relied on certainty. German tank crews, who'd once engaged American armor with confidence, now approached each encounter with the knowledge that their first shot, the shot that should guarantee a kill, might not be enough. And in armored warfare, where the first shot often determined survival, that doubt was as dangerous as any weapon. By early August 1944, the Sandbag armor modification had spread through American armored units in Normandy like wildfire. What had begun as one sergeant's desperate experiment had become a grassroots movement that bypassed official channels and formal approval processes. Tank crews were sharing designs, comparing results, and iterating on the basic concept with the kind of rapid innovation that only happens when survival is the immediate reward for success. But success brought its own problems, and on August 7th, those problems came to a head in the most dramatic way possible. Iron Prayer was part of a task force assigned to exploit the breakthrough at Avranches, where General Patton's Third Army had punched through German lines and was racing toward the Brittany Peninsula. The mission was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. Advance 30 kilometers in 24 hours, seize a bridge over the Sélune River, and hold it against inevitable German counterattacks. Speed was essential, and that's where the Sandbag armor's hidden cost became catastrophic. They'd covered 18 kilometers when Cooper, Iron Prayer's driver, reported a problem. "Sarge, transmission temperature is redlining. We need to stop and let it cool, or we're going to seize the gears." Webb checked his watch. They were behind schedule, and the task force commander had been explicit. No stops except for enemy contact. "How long can you keep us moving?" "Maybe another hour, maybe less." This tank wasn't designed to carry an extra 3 tons of sandbags at sustained high speed. "We're killing the drivetrain." It was the dilemma Webb had known was coming. The Sandbag armor saved lives in combat, but it was destroying the tanks mechanically. The Shermans' engine, transmission, and suspension were engineered for a specific weight and performance envelope. Adding 3 tons of sandbags pushed every system beyond its design limits. Fuel consumption increased by nearly 30%. Track wear accelerated. Engine temperatures ran hot. Transmissions failed. Across the task force, other commanders were reporting similar problems. 2 Shermans had thrown tracks due to the additional weight stressing the suspension. One had suffered a transmission failure and had to be abandoned. The modification that made tanks more survivable in combat was making them less reliable on the march. "Keep us moving," Webb ordered. "We'll deal with the transmission when we reach the objective." They made it another 40 minutes before the decision was taken out of their hands. The task force ran into a German blocking position. 2 Panthers, a company of infantry with Panzerfausts, and at least 1 80mm anti-tank gun positioned to cover the approach to the bridge. The Germans had chosen their ground well, a narrow valley with steep hills on either side, forcing the American column into a kill zone with limited room to maneuver. The lead Sherman was destroyed immediately, hit by the 88mm gun before it could even identify the threat. The second tank tried to reverse and was struck by a Panther, the shell penetrating the thinner rear armor and turning the Sherman into a funeral pyre. The task force was stuck. Advance meant running into prepared defenses. Retreat meant abandoning the mission, and staying in place meant being picked apart by German guns. Webb assessed the situation with the cold calculation that came from months of combat. The German position was strong, but it had a weakness. The Panthers were positioned to cover the road, but the steep hills on either side were considered impassable for tanks. Considered impassable by conventional doctrine, anyway. "Cooper, can you get us up that hill?" Webb asked, pointing to the eastern slope, which rose at approximately 35 degrees and was covered in loose soil and scattered vegetation. Cooper studied the terrain through his periscope. "In a normal Sherman?" Maybe, if we had good traction and a running start. With the extra weight from the sandbags? Sarge, I honestly don't know. We might make it, or we might slide back down, or we might flip the tank. But it's possible. Technically? Yes. Advisable. Hell no. Webb keyed the radio. Baker 6, this is Baker 2-1. Request permission to attempt a flanking maneuver via the eastern slope. There was a pause. Then Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood's voice, tight with stress. 2-1, that slope is too steep for armor. You'll never make it. Sir, with respect, the Germans think the same thing. That's why they're not covering it. If we can get one tank up there, we can hit them from an unexpected angle and break this deadlock. And another pause, longer this time. Webb could imagine Blackwood weighing the options. Lose tanks trying to force the road, or lose a tank trying an impossible maneuver that might create an opening. 2-1, you're authorized. But Webb, if you get stuck up there, we can't recover you. You'll be on your own. Understood, sir. Iron prayer. Moving now. What followed was 10 minutes of the most intense driving of Cooper's life. He approached the slope at an angle, building speed to maintain momentum, then turned hard and started climbing. The Sherman's engine roared, the transmission screamed in protest, and the tracks clawed at the loose soil, throwing up rooster tails of dirt. Inside the tank, the crew was thrown against their stations as the floor tilted at an angle that seemed impossible. "We're slipping!" Cooper shouted. "I'm losing traction on the left track." "Compensate right! Keep the power on!" Webb commanded, though he had no idea if that was the right call. He was making it up as they went, trusting Cooper's instincts and the Sherman's engineering. The tank slewed sideways, the left track spinning uselessly for a moment before catching on a buried rock. The sudden grip jerked the tank forward and upward, and they gained another 10 meters of elevation. Below them, the German position was now visible in profile. The Panthers were oriented toward the road, their flanks exposed to Iron Prayer's position. "Dalton! Target! Panther! 10 o'clock! 600 meters!" "Identified!" Dalton's voice was strained with the effort of keeping his sight picture stable while the tank was at a crazy angle on a hillside. "Fire when ready." The 75mm gun barked, and the armor-piercing round streaked down range, striking the Panther on its side armor, the one place where the Sherman's gun could achieve penetration. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from its engine deck, and the crew began bailing out. But the recoil from the gun did what the slope couldn't. It broke Iron Prayer's tenuous grip on the hillside. The tank began sliding backward, tracks spinning, the crew helpless to stop the descent. They slid 20 meters before the Sherman's rear struck a large boulder, stopping the slide with a bone-jarring impact that threw everyone against their restraints. "Damage report," Webb barked. "Engines still running," Cooper reported, "but we're stuck. The boulders jammed against the rear idler wheel. We're not moving without a recovery vehicle." They were immobilized on a hillside, in sight of German positions, with no way to retreat. It was exactly the nightmare scenario Blackwood had warned about. But Webb's desperate gamble had worked. With one Panther destroyed and the German position flanked, the rest of the task force was able to advance. American infantry stormed the remaining German positions, and within 30 minutes the bridge was secured. Iron Prayer sat on that hillside for 6 hours before a recovery vehicle could reach them. During that time, they were subjected to sporadic German artillery fire and small arms fire from bypass positions. Martinez was wounded by shrapnel from a near miss, a piece of metal the size of a pencil embedding itself in his shoulder. Steinberg used the tank's first aid kit to patch him up, but they all knew Martinez needed proper medical attention. When the recovery vehicle finally arrived, the crew discovered the full extent of the damage. The transmission was destroyed, the final drive was cracked, and the suspension on the left side was bent beyond field repair. The sandbag armor had been shredded by the slide down the hill and the subsequent artillery fire. Iron Prayer, the tank that had survived so many impossible encounters, was mechanically dead. As the crew watched their tank being towed away to a maintenance depot, Steinberg voiced what they were all thinking. We saved the tank from German guns, but we killed it ourselves. The armor worked too well. We kept pushing it into situations no Sherman was designed for, and eventually the machine just gave up. Webb nodded slowly. The sandbags bought us time and saved our lives, but they're not a permanent solution. They're a stopgap, a field expedient. What we really need is a tank that doesn't need sandbags to survive. That evening, as the crew rested in a field hospital while Martinez received treatment, Webb wrote a detailed after-action report. He documented everything: the successes of the sandbag armor, the mechanical failures it caused, the tactical advantages and limitations, and his recommendations for future development. He sent copies to Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood, to division headquarters, and, in a move that bypassed several layers of command, directly to the Army's Ordnance Department. The report would eventually reach engineers at the Detroit Arsenal, where it would influence the design of the M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman, a heavily armored variant that incorporated many of the lessons learned from the sandbag experiments. But that was months in the future. For now, Webb and his crew faced a more immediate question. What next? The answer came the following morning. They were assigned a new Sherman, fresh from the depot, with factory-standard armor and no modifications. As Webb climbed into the commander's cupola, the tank felt naked, vulnerable, like going into battle without a helmet. But orders were orders, and the war didn't stop for mechanical failures or philosophical debates about armor doctrine. "Mount up," Webb ordered. "We've got a war to win." As Iron Prayer 2, as they'd already started calling the new tank, rolled toward the front lines, Webb reflected on the paradox they'd discovered. Innovation could save lives, but it could also create new problems that required new innovations. It was a cycle without end, a race between human ingenuity and the brutal physics of war. And in that race, the only certainty was that standing still meant death. By mid-August 1944, the German position in Normandy had deteriorated from difficult to catastrophic. The American breakout at Avranches, combined with British and Canadian pressure in the north, had created the conditions for a massive encirclement. German forces were being compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket around the town of Falaise, and the roads east, the only escape routes, were under constant Allied air attack. For Oberst Friedrich Hartmann and the remnants of Panzer Division, the sandbag armor that had seemed like a curious anomaly in July had become a symbol of a larger, more disturbing reality. The Americans were winning not through superior equipment or tactics, but through adaptability and sheer material abundance. The sandbag modification was just one example of a broader pattern. American forces were learning, adapting and innovating faster than German forces could respond. On August 17th, Hartmann's command post received a report that crystallized the desperation of their situation. A German reconnaissance unit had observed an American armored column, at least 30 Shermans, moving to cut off one of the last escape routes from the Falaise pocket. What made the report significant was the notation: approximately 80% of observed enemy tanks display external armor modifications consistent with sandbag arrays. Enemy appears to have standardized the modification across multiple units. Hartmann read the report twice, then set it down with the careful precision of a man trying to maintain composure. "They've industrialized it," he said to Hauptmann Steiner. "What started as one sergeant's field experiment has become standard operating procedure. Do you understand what that means?" Steiner, who'd lost 20 pounds in the past month and looked a decade older than his 38 years, nodded grimly. "It means our anti-tank weapons are no longer reliably effective against their most common tank. It means the tactical advantage we've relied on since 1940 has been neutralized by burlap and sand. It means," Hartmann continued, "that we're fighting an enemy who can afford to experiment, fail, learn and implement solutions faster than we can develop countermeasures. They have the resources to let individual crews modify their tanks in the field. We can barely keep our existing tanks fueled and armed. The contrast was stark and demoralizing. While American tank crews were adding protective modifications and replacing damaged equipment within days, German units were cannibalizing disabled vehicles for parts, rationing ammunition, and operating tanks with mechanical defects that would have grounded them under normal circumstances. The Panther that Hartmann was using as his command vehicle had a malfunctioning transmission that limited it to 3 forward gears, and there were no replacement parts available. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Lieutenant Hans Becker, the young Panther commander, had been wounded in an engagement near Argentan and was recovering in a field hospital when Hartmann visited. Becker's Panther had been destroyed by a modified Sherman that had survived 3 hits from his 75mm gun before closing to point-blank range and firing into the Panther's side armor. "Sir, I did everything right," Becker said, his voice hollow with exhaustion and trauma. "I achieved first-round hits at optimal range. I aimed for the center of mass, exactly as trained. The shells struck the target. I saw the impacts. But the American tank kept coming. It was like fighting a ghost. How do you kill something that won't die?" Hartmann had no answer that would comfort the young officer. The truth was that the Sandbag armor, combined with American numerical superiority and air dominance, had created a situation where German tactical excellence was no longer sufficient. A German tank crew might be better trained, more experienced, and equipped with superior weapons. But if their first shot didn't achieve a kill, they were overwhelmed by American numbers. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket became a demonstration of this new reality. German forces attempting to escape the encirclement had to run a gauntlet of American and Canadian armor, and the modified Shermans proved devastatingly effective in the close-range, chaotic engagements that characterized the battle. German after-action reports from the period are filled with references to American tanks that absorbed multiple hits and continued to advance despite apparent damage. One report, filed by Major Otto Kraus before he was killed by American artillery on August 19th, provides a particularly vivid account. Engaged enemy armor at approximately 400 meters, achieved 3 confirmed hits on lead enemy tank with 88mm gun, expected catastrophic kill, observed deflections and non-penetrating hits. Enemy tank closed to 150 meters and destroyed our position with direct fire. Crew morale severely affected by apparent invulnerability of enemy armor. Request immediate tactical guidance or withdrawal authorization. The withdrawal authorization never came. By August 21st, the Falaise Pocket was closed and approximately 50,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. Hartmann was among the captured, surrendering to Canadian forces after his command vehicle ran out of fuel during an attempted breakout. In the POW cage, surrounded by the remnants of units that had once been the pride of the Wehrmacht, Hartmann had time to reflect on what had happened. In conversations with other captured officers, a consensus emerged. The Sandbag armor itself wasn't the decisive factor in Germany's defeat in Normandy. The Allies would have won regardless, through their overwhelming advantages in numbers, logistics, and air power. But the Sandbag modification had accelerated the collapse by neutralizing one of Germany's few remaining advantages: the superior anti-tank capability of German weapons. More significantly, the Sandbag armor represented a philosophical difference that Germany couldn't match. American forces were decentralized, pragmatic, and willing to embrace unconventional solutions. German forces were centralized, doctrinaire, and constrained by a command structure that discouraged initiative at lower levels. When an American sergeant had an idea, he could test it, implement it, and spread it through informal networks. When a German sergeant had an idea, it had to go through layers of approval, and by the time a decision was made, the tactical situation had changed. In a letter written from the POW camp and later discovered by historians, Hartmann wrote, "We lost to an enemy who was willing to look foolish in pursuit of effectiveness. Their sandbag armor was crude, inelegant, and violated every principle of proper military engineering. But it worked. We were so concerned with doing things correctly that we forgot the only thing that matters in war is doing things effectively. The Americans understood that survival is more important than aesthetics, and adaptation is more valuable than doctrine. This is why they won. Among the American forces, the success of the sandbag armor was celebrated but also analyzed critically. Webb, now promoted to lieutenant and given command of a tank platoon, participated in a series of after-action reviews where the modification's effectiveness was quantified. The statistics were striking. Shermans with sandbag armor modifications had a 47% higher survival rate in frontal engagements compared to unmodified Shermans. The modification reduced penetration probability of German 75mm and 88mm guns by approximately 35 to 40% at typical combat ranges. However, the modification also increased mechanical failure rates by 28% and reduced operational range by 22% due to increased fuel consumption. The Army's conclusion was pragmatic. The sandbag armor was an effective field expedient that had saved lives and contributed to tactical success, but it was not a long-term solution. The lessons learned would be incorporated into future tank designs, but for now, crews were authorized to continue using the modification at their discretion, with the understanding that they were trading mechanical reliability for combat survivability. For the German forces, there was no silver lining. The Falaise Pocket marked the effective end of German military power in France. The divisions that escaped were shadows of their former strength, and the material losses, including hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles, could not be replaced. The sandbag armor had been one factor among many in this defeat, but it was a factor that symbolized a larger truth. Germany was losing the war of innovation as surely as it was losing the war of production. In September 1944, as Allied forces raced across France toward the German border, Webb's platoon encountered a destroyed German Panther that had been abandoned by its crew. Painted on the turret, in rough English, was a message: "To the Americans with the sandbags, you win. We cannot kill what will not die." Webb photographed the message and included it in his personal journal. Decades later, when interviewed by military historians, he would reflect on that moment. "We didn't set out to break German morale. We just wanted to survive. But I think that message on the Panther shows what really happened in Normandy. We convinced them that their advantages weren't enough. We showed them that we could adapt faster than they could respond, and once they lost faith in their superiority, the outcome was inevitable." The sandbag armor had done more than deflect shells. It had deflected certainty, and in war, certainty is often the only thing keeping an army fighting. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, and with it came the inevitable process of assessment, documentation, and learning. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Department conducted extensive studies on field modifications and their effectiveness, and the sandbag armor received particular attention. What had begun as one crew's desperate experiment had become a case study in innovation, adaptation, and the complex relationship between doctrine and reality. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, now a captain and serving in the occupation forces in Germany, was summoned to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland to participate in a comprehensive evaluation of the sandbag armor system. He arrived in August 1945, still wearing the uniform he'd worn through France, Belgium, and into Germany, and found himself in a world that felt alien after years of combat. Clean laboratories, precise measurements, and engineers who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. The lead engineer, Dr. Robert Morrison, a civilian who'd spent the war designing armor systems, greeted Webb with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "Captain Webb, your field reports have been illuminating. We'd like to understand exactly how you developed this modification and why it worked when conventional theory suggested it shouldn't." Over the next 3 weeks, Webb worked with Morrison's team to recreate the Sandbag armor system and subject it to rigorous testing. They fired captured German weapons at modified Sherman hulls, measured energy dissipation, analyzed deflection angles, and documented every variable. The results confirmed what Webb had learned through trial and error in Normandy. The Sandbag armor worked through a combination of energy absorption, trajectory disruption, and increased effective armor thickness. But the testing also revealed something Webb hadn't fully understood. The Sandbag armor was most effective against the specific types of ammunition the Germans had been using in 1944. Armor-piercing rounds with relatively soft steel cores and moderate velocities were disrupted by the sand medium. However, newer ammunition types with harder cores and higher velocities, the kind being developed late in the war, were less affected by the Sandbag arrays. In other words, Morrison explained, you found a solution that was perfectly optimized for the threat you were facing at that specific moment in the war. If the war had continued another year and the Germans had adapted their ammunition, your modification might have become less effective. Webb nodded slowly. So we got lucky. We found a solution that worked against the weapons they had, not necessarily against the weapons they could have developed. Not luck, Morrison corrected. Adaptation. You identified a problem, developed a solution with the resources available, and implemented it faster than the enemy could respond. That's not luck, that's good engineering under constraints, and it's exactly the kind of thinking we need to incorporate into future doctrine. The Army's official report on the Sandbag armor, published in 1946, was remarkably candid. It acknowledged that the modification had been developed outside official channels, that it violated existing regulations, and that it had caused mechanical problems. But it also concluded that the modification had saved lives, improved combat effectiveness, and demonstrated the value of empowering lower-level personnel to innovate. The report's recommendations were far-reaching. Future tank designs should incorporate lessons learned from the Sandbag armor, including spaced armor concepts and attention to deflection angles. More significantly, the report recommended changes to doctrine and training to encourage field innovation and rapid adaptation. The Army should create formal mechanisms for testing and implementing field modifications rather than relying on informal networks and individual initiative. These recommendations would influence the development of post-war American armor, including the M48 Patton and M60 tanks, which incorporated spaced armor and compound angles, inspired partly by the Sandbag experiments. The concept of reactive armor, which would become standard on tanks in the 1980s, had its intellectual roots in the same principles Webb had stumbled upon in a muddy field in Normandy. But perhaps the most significant legacy was cultural rather than technical. The Sandbag armor became a symbol within the U.S. military of the importance of adaptability and the value of listening to frontline personnel. It was cited in training manuals, discussed in military academies, and held up as an example of how innovation could come from unexpected sources. Webb himself returned to civilian life in 1946, resuming his career as an automotive engineer in Detroit. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, but in 1964 he was invited to speak at the Army War College about innovation in combat. His speech, delivered to an audience of senior officers, included a passage that would be quoted in military journals for decades. The Sandbag armor worked not because it was the best possible solution, but because it was the best solution we could implement with what we had, where we were, when we needed it. Perfect is the enemy of good enough, and in war, good enough right now is better than perfect next month. The lesson isn't that sandbags are magic. The lesson is that when you give intelligent people a problem and the freedom to solve it, they'll find ways that no manual ever anticipated. The crew of Iron Prayer remained close after the war. Dalton became a high school teacher in Ohio. Steinberg completed his physics degree at MIT and worked on the Apollo program. Cooper opened a garage in Texas and became known for his ability to fix anything with an engine. Martinez returned to New Mexico and raised a family, though the shrapnel wound in his shoulder ached every winter for the rest of his life. They reunited every 5 years, gathering at different locations to remember the men who hadn't made it home, and to celebrate the fact that they had. At the 1984 reunion, 40 years after Normandy, they visited the National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Benning, where a Sherman tank with sandbag armor was on display. The placard read, M4A1 Sherman, with field-modified armor circa 1944. This modification, developed by frontline crews in Normandy, demonstrated the effectiveness of improvised solutions to tactical problems and influenced post-war armor design. Webb stood in front of the display for a long time, his hand resting on the sandbags that had been carefully preserved and mounted on the museum tank. "You know what's funny?" he said to his old crew. "We were just trying not to die. We weren't thinking about history or doctrine or influencing future designs. We were scared kids trying to survive long enough to see home again." "And that's exactly why it worked," Steinberg replied. "Because it was real. It wasn't some theoretical exercise or a design committee's compromise. It was a solution born from necessity, tested under fire, and proven in the only laboratory that matters: actual combat." The sandbag armor story became part of the larger narrative of World War II, a war won not just through industrial might or strategic brilliance, but through the accumulated efforts of thousands of individuals who refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. From the Norden bomb site to the proximity fuse, from the Liberty ships to the atomic bomb, the Allied victory was built on innovation at every level. But unlike those high-tech marvels, the sandbag armor represented something more accessible and democratic. It didn't require advanced degrees or classified research facilities. It required observation, analysis, experimentation, and the courage to try something that looked absurd. It proved that innovation wasn't the exclusive domain of scientists and engineers in laboratories. It could come from a sergeant with an engineering background and a crew willing to trust his crazy idea. In 1994, 50 years after D-Day, Webb was interviewed by a military historian working on a comprehensive study of tactical innovations in World War II. The historian asked him what he thought was the most important lesson from the sandbag armor experience. Webb, now 74 years old, and speaking with the deliberation of someone who'd had decades to think about the question, replied, "The lesson is that the people closest to a problem often have the best insights into solving it, but only if they're given the freedom and resources to try. The army could have shut us down. They could have said, 'That's not in the manual, stop wasting time and materials.' Instead, they gave us 48 hours to prove it worked. That willingness to let us try, that's what made the difference. And if you could go back and change anything about how the modification was developed or implemented?" the historian asked. Webb smiled, a sad expression that carried the weight of old memories. "I'd want to have figured it out sooner. Every tank we lost before we developed the sandbag armor was a crew that didn't have to die. Every day we spent following doctrine that wasn't working was a day we could have been adapting. The real tragedy isn't that we had to use sandbags, it's that we didn't question the inadequacy of our armor sooner." Marcus Webb died in 2003 at the age of 83. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his wartime service, but focused primarily on his post-war career and his family. It didn't mention the sandbag armor or the lives saved by his innovation. But at his funeral, attended by the surviving members of his crew and their families, there was a display that told the story. Photographs of Iron Prayer with its distinctive sandbag arrays, copies of the after-action reports, and a small sandbag, carefully preserved for nearly 60 years, that had been part of the original modification. The final speaker at the funeral was Dr. David Steinberg, Webb's former loader, now a retired NASA engineer. He concluded his eulogy with words that captured the essence of what they'd accomplished together. Marcus taught us that innovation isn't about having the best resources or the most advanced technology. It's about refusing to accept that a problem is unsolvable. In the summer of 1944, we were told that Sherman tanks couldn't survive against German guns. Marcus said, "Maybe not, but let's try something anyway." There's that willingness to try, to experiment, to risk looking foolish in pursuit of effectiveness. That's his legacy. Not the sandbags themselves, but the mindset that created them. The belief that there's always a solution if you're willing to look for it, even in the most unlikely places. The sandbag armor of World War II remains a footnote in most histories of the conflict, overshadowed by more dramatic innovations and decisive battles. But for the tank crews who used it, and for the military theorists who studied it, the modification represented something profound, proof that in the chaos and horror of war, human ingenuity and adaptability could tip the scales between survival and annihilation. It was a reminder that sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones that look absurd until they save your life. The story of Marcus Webb and his crew reminds us that history's greatest innovations often come from the most unexpected places, not from laboratories or high command, but from the front lines where necessity drives invention. If this story of courage, ingenuity, and survival against impossible odds moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. Share your thoughts in the comments. What other absurd innovations from history do you think changed the course of war? And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story of human resilience and ingenuity. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the difference between defeat and victory is simply refusing to accept that something can't be done.